The medieval period, spanning from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, was marked by dramatic social, political, and religious transformations across Europe and beyond. This era saw the rise and fall of kingdoms, the spread of Christianity, and the development of feudal societies. But beyond these grand historical events, the medieval world also had its own unique relationship with intimacy, sexuality, and privacy, shaped by religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and the realities of medieval life. In the medieval world, the concept of privacy as we understand it today was still largely non-existent. People lived in close quarters, often in small villages or large, overcrowded castles, where walls were thin and personal space was minimal. Even for the wealthiest individuals, privacy was a privilege that was reserved for only the most elite. For the common people, privacy was virtually unheard of. Let's explore how intimacy and sex were experienced in the medieval world, from the Dark Ages to the Renaissance, and how the church, feudalism, and societal norms shaped people's understanding of privacy. In medieval Europe, Christianity played a central role in shaping the moral and ethical framework of society. The Catholic Church, in particular, had a profound influence on how people viewed sex, intimacy, and personal privacy. The Church's teachings were clear. Sex was only acceptable within the confines of marriage and was primarily for procreation. The idea of sexual pleasure was viewed with suspicion and often deemed sinful. This religious outlook had a significant impact on both public and private life. In a society where religious dogma permeated every aspect of daily life, it was not surprising that many forms of intimacy became deeply entwined with guilt, shame, and the need for secrecy. Public expression of sexual desire was taboo, and anything that deviated from the Church's teachings on chastity and monogamy was seen as sinful. However, the Church's influence was not absolute. Despite the moral teachings, medieval society was far from sexually repressed. There were contradictions between religious doctrine and human behavior, leading to the growth of secretive practices and informal attitudes towards sexuality. These contradictions often made intimacy a complex and private matter, despite the Church's attempts to regulate and control it. Marriage during the medieval period was primarily seen as a social contract, often arranged for political, economic, or familial reasons. Love was not the driving force behind most medieval marriages. Family alliances and the need for heirs were much more important. As a result, sexual intimacy within marriage was often viewed as a duty rather than a pleasure. Marriage contracts were formal, and sex within marriage was expected to follow strict rules. The Church allowed for sexual relations within marriage, but they had to adhere to certain guidelines. Marital sex was meant for procreation, and any pleasure derived from it was viewed with suspicion. Contraception was forbidden, and sexual intercourse during times when a woman was menstruating or during Lent was also prohibited. Despite these restrictions, the reality was different. Medieval men and women still engaged in sex for pleasure, and there were various ways in which individuals found moments of intimacy. It wasn't uncommon for married couples to have sexual relations that were not always about procreation. But this could not be done openly, as it conflicted with the teachings of the Church. Thus, much of sexual intimacy in marriage occurred in a private, hidden, and sometimes secretive manner. The nobility, living in grand castles and estates, had more physical space and privacy than common folk, but their personal lives were often still subject to scrutiny. Although the elite had their own chambers and private quarters, their lives were not entirely private. Marriage among the noble classes was often about political alliances, land acquisition, and securing heirs. As a result, sexual relationships were sometimes controlled by the family or the state, with marriages often arranged when individuals were still very young. Even in these higher circles of society, personal privacy was rare. Banquets, tournaments, and feasts were public events, and the court's activities were often on display for others to witness. These public displays were accompanied by gossip, rumors, and scandals about the personal lives of the nobility. Infidelity was common among both men and women of the upper classes, but it was often hidden behind closed doors and discreet affairs. Sexual scandals involving royal families or nobles were frequently publicized and often became the subject of court gossip and even public discourse. For example, the affair between King Henry VIII of England and Anne Boleyn, which eventually led to his break with the Catholic Church, was not a private matter. This scandal played out in front of the entire nation and changed the course of history. For the aristocracy and royalty, having concubines was a common practice. These women were often seen as secondary wives and had a recognized position in society, although they were not afforded the same privileges as a primary wife. Concubines were often used to produce heirs, particularly when a wife was unable to have children. The relationship between a nobleman and his concubine was generally accepted by society, although it was considered private and discreet. While wives were expected to produce legitimate heirs, it was not unusual for noblemen to have extramarital affairs. These relationships, though often kept hidden, were sometimes tolerated, particularly if they were with women of a similar social standing. However, if these affairs became too public or scandalous, they could lead to political or social consequences. For the common people, the idea of privacy was almost non-existent. Most peasants lived in small, overcrowded homes with extended families, making it impossible to keep intimate matters private. Personal space was limited, and people were often forced to share sleeping areas with others, sometimes even with animals. These close living conditions meant that sexual activity, even within marriage, was rarely private. In rural villages, life was public in many ways. The community was tightly knit, and social interactions took place in shared spaces such as the village square, the church, and the market. Because privacy was so limited, everyone knew everyone else's business. This meant that personal relationships, whether sexual, romantic, or familial, were often matters of public knowledge. Even so, sex and relationships were not openly discussed in the same way they were in the nobility. The church's influence over the common people was strong, and sexual matters were often hidden behind a veil of secrecy and shame. People were expected to adhere to strict religious standards, and any deviation from these norms could lead to public humiliation or punishment. The Church's authority in medieval life extended to sexual matters, dictating not only when and how people could have sex, but also imposing punishments on those who violated its teachings. Adultery, fornication, and homosexuality were considered sinful and were punished harshly. The Church controlled sexual morality, and many individuals lived in fear of being caught violating its rules. Confession, a sacrament in which individuals confessed their sins to a priest, provided a degree of privacy, but the concept of personal privacy was still vastly different from today's standards. The fact that sexual transgressions were confessed publicly in church, whether to a priest or during a public trial, meant that privacy was once again lost. In medieval society, prostitution was widely accepted as a necessary evil. While the Church condemned it as sinful, brothels and prostitutes were still a common fixture in most towns and cities. In fact, many medieval cities had designated areas for prostitution, which were often regulated by local authorities. Prostitutes were considered to be outside the boundaries of respectable society, yet their services were in high demand, particularly among soldiers, merchants, and travelers. Prostitution, like sex itself, was far from private. It was a public business, often talked about openly, and sometimes even sanctioned by authorities. By the end of the medieval period, especially during the Renaissance, there was a gradual shift in the understanding of privacy and intimacy. The rise of individualism, the growing influence of the Renaissance humanism, and the changes brought about by the Reformation and the rise of new religious ideas began to challenge the rigid social and sexual structures of medieval society. As cities became more developed and the nobility sought more exclusive living arrangements, the concept of personal privacy began to take root. But for the majority of medieval people, privacy, especially in matters of sexuality, remained a distant dream. Intimacy was something shared with others in both the literal and figurative senses. It was a time when personal lives were often open to public scrutiny, shaped by religion, politics, and the harsh realities of life in the Middle Ages. The medieval era was a time of great complexity when it came to sexuality and privacy. The idea of personal space was limited by the structures of feudalism, religion, and the realities of medieval life. The Church's strict teachings on sex and intimacy governed people's behaviors, and any deviation from the accepted norms could have serious consequences. Despite the Church's influence, medieval people still found ways to express their sexuality, albeit often in secret, through extramarital affairs, prostitution, and even through their involvement in religious rituals that incorporated sexuality. Privacy, particularly in intimate matters, was a luxury that only the few could enjoy, and even for them, personal lives were frequently on display for public consumption. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, attitudes toward privacy and sexuality would begin to change. But during the 500 to 1500 AD period, sex and intimacy were anything but private affairs.